Luke Taylor.
We spoke about advice from previous Prime Ministers, whether that was involved in the appointment. Just a query about what role the outgoing Cabinet Secretary Simon Case played in the appointment process.
So we at the outset, we discussed, Simon Case and I, we discussed what a potential job specification would look like. We discussed what an external panel composition would be appropriate. But the final word over agreeing that was then with the Prime Minister. And I then took charge of the process and chairing the panels. And Simon provided advice to the Prime Minister separate from what I did in terms of the panel.
Do you think that because the Simon Case standing down was so long telegraphed that his role in the replacement was more appropriate than, say, if a secretary was being replaced in a much more urgent basis, as it were?
No, I don't think so. I think so if you look at the Cabinet Manual, and it sort of says, the retiring Cabinet Secretary, so that advice role and just how active that is a choice of the circumstances. But the second one is the first Civil Service Commissioner's advice, and to me what was important, that there had to be a process on which I could justify my advice. And on what basis does the first Civil Service Commissioner, particularly when, in my case, I wasn't a former permanent secretary, would arrive at decision, and therefore a panel with external candidates where we tested gave a good basis for that report. And Simon Case, as former head of the Civil Service, would provide a different dimension, which would directly go to the Prime Minister.
Anything else, Mr. Chair?
And are you content that that should be the case in the future? Would that role be more formalised? I think in the private sector you'd have an exit interview when a employee was leaving an organisation. You might kind of take feedback from them into shaping the role, changing the role, assessing the suitability of future employees. Do you think that process should be more formalised, or is it very much a case-by-case basis, as it were?
I think you're now tempting me into HR decisions within government, which is probably not the regulator's task. But government made two significant decisions in that context. One is the Prime Minister decided that the role of Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service would remain in one function, which historically we've seen there have been attempts to separate it at some stage. And similarly, the fact that the Cabinet Office's Permanent Secretary is the Chief Operating Officer of the Civil Service also was a fairly recent innovation. And that gives you an indication that the government made some decisions to keep those structures.
Anecdotally, or it could be argued that the role does seem to have quite a heavy toll on the bearer, and does that come into, first of all, the workload of having both those hats to wear, and also the potential single point of failure, as it were, if that person is incapacitated or signed off sick for a while? Does that lead to any conclusions in the wisdom of all of that responsibility being on one pair of shoulders?
You are now seriously leading me astray into areas where probably if you had former cabinet secretaries to give evidence who have much more of a first-hand experience of what the lived experience of that role is and how they feel how you can handle it and how you respond to it.
Those questions not part of the appointment procedure?
The part of the appointment procedure was that we kind of really tested in terms of the questions of how is their personal resilience? How do they deal with stress? What are their responses to when you have those demands? How do they end up prioritizing? That would be a set of questions you probably have at most of those top rows, but with that one in specifically, that was an area of questioning.